Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from around the world, and welcome to today's webinar about CNI Solar. Today with us is Samridh Goyal, founder and CEO of Solar Horizon, and he will tell you basically everything you need to know about CNI project development in emerging markets. Before we go to Sam's presentation, I'm going to take you through today's agenda. So I'll do a small introduction on why we do this webinar today, what Solarplaza does, and I'll tell you a little bit about our upcoming event. After that, Sam will do his presentation on everything you need to know about CNI Solar. And then in the end, there's a Q&A. So please send in your questions already during his presentation. We'll filter them and we'll make sure that all the questions will be answered. And before we start, a bit about Solarplaza. Our company exists now for 15 years. We're based in Rotterdam, and we organize solar conferences around the world, over 140 now in over 40 countries. And you're part of that 60,000 solar professionals network. We do webinars, content, and also events. This webinar today is in the run-up to our Making Solar Bankable event happening on the 6th and 7th of February in Amsterdam. It's about scaling bankable solar, as solar is pretty much bankable in emerging markets. Besides our normal program with panels, we have some world-class keynotes and we have some interactive workshops at the conference. You'll meet about 600 high-level finance and development executives from over 40 countries. So again, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, 6th and 7th February, and hope to see you there. Besides the conferences we do, we also publish free content. Building Solar Businesses is an example. Sam, today's presenter, was featured there as an expert, some interviews. Also interesting, the Purchases Guide to Solar PPAs, which is of course related to today's content, but won't be discussed that much. And on the right, you see our Spanish report. Please go ahead and check out our content online. Some practical notes about today's webinar. For the questions, please use the question box. For any technical issues, please use the chat box. The Q&A will once again happen at the end, but please already send in your questions during the presentation as we need to filter them. The most asked question you don't have to ask. Yes, we will share the slides after the presentation, and we will also send you the recordings of this webinar. So you'll get an email with the recordings probably somewhere tomorrow morning. So then to today's presenter, founder and CEO of Solar Horizon. He was recognized as one of the 50 future global green leaders for his contribution in specifically CNI solar in Southeast Asia. He's active in CNI solar PV financing, origination, development, and execution and management. That's also why we asked him to be an expert featured in the report, but mostly why we asked him for today's webinar about everything you need to know about CNI solar project development. So Sam, we're going to unmute you and we're going to start your presentation and hand over controls to you right now.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, for that introduction. Thanks to all of you for joining in from all around the world. My name is Sam Goyal, founder and CEO of Solar Horizon, and I am speaking to all of you from Singapore, where it is 10:07 p.m. So with that, let us get started. I've just taken over the controls, and here we go. As a quick background, guys, we're going to go through a very in-depth presentation today. I am treating this as a chance to share with all of you my learnings and experience over 10 years within the CNI space. I was doing this much before solar was cool, and I'm glad that we've hung on this long because I really believe the future is sunny and the future is now. So with that, let's get started with a quick presentation outline. Basically, today we're going to do a very short introduction of Solar Horizon, my company, just to give you some context on who we are, what we do. We're then going to do an overview of CNI Solar, give you guys a glimpse of what it actually is, what it means, what does it look like. We're then going to dive into the real meat of the content. The first is about building the ecosystem that really is what's needed to be effective in CNI Solar. It's quite different from utility. We're then going to go to the 4 pillars of the business: project origination. Where do you find these clients? How do you close deals? We then go through the development process, the technical, financial, and contractual considerations. We then, I'm quite happy to share, we are going to share a live case study on execution, which is actually our most recent project, a 1.7 megawatt for a government telco in Singapore, which is under construction and almost completed. So I'm going to use this opportunity to take you guys through step by step and really show you how a CNI solar project comes to life. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about managing what happens after the project is commissioned. So with that, let's get started. Short introduction on Solar Horizon. Basically, we are a boutique developer and CNI solar specialist, right? This is all we do. This is all we have been founded upon. Commercial, industrial, unsubsidized solar, on-site PPA. We started in Singapore in 2013. I myself have been in CNI solar for almost 10 years now. And I decided to go out on my own with some partners to set this up and see how we can make a difference. So we are active along the entire value chain, from origination, development, financing, implementation, and management. We've done about 20 megawatt of CNI so far. Compared to the utility side, it may not sound like much, but trust me, that's a lot of rooftops and a lot of panels. And one thing important is that we are an independent developer, which means, unlike a lot of the players in the industry, we are not vertically integrated. We are proud to be entrepreneurs. We are proud to build ecosystems that enable a bunch of other players to play together. And that's one of the core founding values of our company. I'm going to not spend too much time on the length and breadth of services. Basically, suffice to say, we handle the entire process from deal origination, feasibilities, due diligence, raising money, managing the projects, getting the EPCs in place, managing the assets. And we've been doing this for quite a while, so we do have some decent experience to share with you today. Just a very quick glimpse of the different projects and portfolios. Like I said, there's a lot of rooftops. We were quite proud to have done some of the first of its kind projects in Singapore, first in the defense sector, in the marine sector. Over here, the recent one is for a major government telco, which is a data center that's a 10,000 square meter rooftop. And we've also been lucky to do a very nice theme park in Bali, Indonesia, which is a beautiful place to visit, but also very sunny and great for solar. So anyway, these are just a few of the clients, but I'd like to skip forward now to the overview. So I'm going to start by showing you a number of different types of commercial and industrial solar projects, right? This is actually Asia's tallest PV installation. It's a 43-story tower. What you can see is that there's not much space on the rooftop for solar. So it's not the best kind of profile. Conversely, this is the Universal Studios in Singapore. This is about a 0.5 megawatt project on a large flat roof with a high constant load, which is a very good profile for solar. This was actually our first industrial project all those years ago, which is also pretty well suited when you have straight flat industrial rooftops. Similar to this one's quite a challenging project. I'll be coming back to this a bit later. This is where they build oil rigs. This is an actual 15-meter tall building, and you'll see some of the challenges and how you need to address some of these challenges in a little while. Just very quickly, for those who are not so familiar with solar, when it comes to the rooftop, there's a number of different ways to install these things to the roof. Your most common is a clamp-based system where there's no drilling. You also have a drill-based system where you go into the purlins. And finally, a reinforced concrete roof where you use a ballast solution. So this should hopefully give you a feel and flavor of the different kind of CNI installations, okay? Right, let's talk about building the ecosystem. For us, we believe that nobody can do this alone. I mean, that's my belief in life. You know, there's an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So we decided that as a business, partners, and these are the kind of 4 key elements to the CNI, or commercial industrial solar space. You have your off-taker, which is a simple, I mean, it's a complicated word for somebody who owns a rooftop, who's willing to use the solar power, host the solar system, enter into a PPA, and basically provide the key ingredient for the solar project to come to life. You then have the developer, which is Solar Horizon. We sit in the middle of this picture. It's kind of a nucleus model, where on one side we work with our clients, assess their sites, do their proposals, negotiate with them, get squeezed by them, build good relationships. We then, you know, you need a technical partner to this thing, right? Generally, it's an EPC or engineering, procurement, construction contractor. You would find that the specialized EPCs for CNI have quite a different DNA from the big, huge EPCs that do these large utility projects. So having a technical partner is important. Later, you'll see why. And finally, you need the cash, the money, because basically these are third-party finance systems, right? So finding investors who can fund CNI projects used to be one of our biggest challenges. That has changed, and we're going to address that in depth later on. But basically, this gives you a good overview of how the ecosystem in CNI works: the off-taker, the developer, the EPC, and the investor. Right? Now, when you have an ecosystem, there has to be a good level of risk management and risk allocation. So what I want to show you here is that, at the front end of the development cycle, generally these are the risky stages, right? In the sense we run around doing proposals, surveying rooftops, spending a lot of time, effort, and money without necessarily getting a deal. So this is what's considered the development risk that a developer takes. This inflection point is generally in our business when a PPA is signed or a deal is awarded. That's generally when the investor comes into the picture and the EPC. Of course, there's some construction risk, and once the project is handed over is where the highest value is. So based around this kind of project life cycle, there's a number of ways for developers to earn their money, right? It could be as simple as a developer fee, paid out at different milestones. It could be what's called sweat equity, where you take a stake in the project alongside the investor and enjoy a portion of the long-term returns. There are different ways to earn out, where maybe over 2 or 3 or 5 years, you get a kicker and you exit. There's also some upside sharing. For example, if your project can deliver higher returns than you forecast, it's very fair to ask for a piece of that. And the hardest one, which is we're still trying, is to get investors to come a bit up this curve and start to fund development. But that's a whole other topic on how you get investors to fund you early on. But I think this should give you an idea of how that development cycle and project life cycle works. So, we believe in symbiosis, right? We don't feel that any one party or any one stakeholder should shoulder all the risk. It's just not fair and it's not sustainable. So if you look at some of the key risks, looking at the financing risk, well, clearly it's the investor who takes on that risk. He's putting up the money and he's going to wait for the next 20 years to get his return. So we need to be mindful that while we do a lot of the upfront work, somebody else's money is funding that and taking the risk over the long term. So you need to get your modeling right, your assumptions correct, build a good system, and so on. You then have the operational risk, and this kind of falls between the EPC as well as the developer, as well as the investor, right? So therefore, you need tight O&M contracts, good generation reporting. The energy price risk is what I think the adopter or the off-taker takes, because they enter into a kind of fixed or negotiated price for the next 20-something years. And obviously, the price in the market, their utilities, is a direct consequence of their savings, right? Direct function of their savings. And then you have the technology risk, which thankfully solar is considered a mature technology, and it's something that's quite well known. So therefore the risk is pretty low. But the idea is to give you all a feel as to how these different risks are allocated. Okay, we're now going to get into a big chunky section, origination. Where do you get these deals from? Where do you find these clients? How do you convince them to give you their rooftops and enter into these relatively long-term contracts, right? Well, I think customer targeting is key. I've used an example of Indonesia, which is probably the largest country in Southeast Asia. It's comprised of 14,000 islands. It has a huge spread in generation in terms of the irradiation that happens across the country. So using this as an example, well, basically any operating business with a rooftop is a potential candidate for solar PPA or solar leasing or solar rental, whatever you like to call it. Now, what we found is, entities with good credit rating are critical, because coming back to the earlier point, the investor is taking that long-term risk, right? So if you look for well-established family-owned businesses, manufacturers, of course, mid to large-size corporations, local listed companies, multinational corporations, state-owned enterprises, ports, airports, hospitals, shopping malls. I mean, the list is endless, right? Your supermarkets, wherever you look, basically the urban landscape is very rich in terms of potentially hosting solar. What's important is that you got to do your targeting correctly, right? So as an example, if you look at this map, if you look at places like Bali, which is where we did a project, it's super high in radiation, versus Java, it's much lower. So if I have the same tariff and the same cost structure, clearly, wherever I have more sunlight, I would produce more yield and therefore higher returns, higher savings. So the way we will always suggest is, look at your geographical spread. You need to know your local market, right? As a developer, localization is key. So you need to know your market, be it a nation, be it a continent, be it a region, be it a city, and then be able to differentiate, okay, where are the industrial clusters? Who are the right kind of clients? Where are the big shopping malls? And then drill down, where do I get a better irradiation? Where is there better access? Where is there places where perhaps power is limited? So using all of these different filters, I think is the right way to do customer targeting. Also, facilities with a high load. The reason is not every geography has a net metering system in place, i.e. if you feed back to the grid energy that's not used, sometimes you can't get paid for it. So when you apply all these different filters to start picking off your low-hanging fruit, I think at least that's what we learned is a good way to start, right? My slides go. Okay, now another key point is key messaging. How do you convince your client about the benefits of solar, right? Why a solar PPA or financing or leasing? I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. Well, there's a very strong and clear fundamental benefit, right? Which is basically activating an underutilized resource, which is the rooftop, harnessing a free and eternal source of power, which is sunlight, to generate your own clean power and save your business money at no cost and at no risk, because there's no upfront capex required. There's no long-term operational risk. So, what we found is, and this is one of the competitive strategies, by able to convince your customer on the benefits of solar, and starting with the why, the fundamental question is why. So if you look at some of these points, it's a pretty strong value proposition, right? Immediate cost savings, zero investment. You only pay for what you use. You get guaranteed savings. And of course, you get the great leadership story at zero cost. So I think we've learned that having very clear, very punchy key messaging to the client is an important part of this, right? And similarly, that you'll see, we really highlight the benefits, right? The zero capex, show them how much they're saving, hedges against utility prices. In most parts of the world, utility prices are rising. Of course, the publicity and hype that comes around it. And increasingly, I'm happy and so pleased to see that the motivation and driver is no longer just, hey, I want cost savings. It's also that, hey, we actually care about the environment. Our company has committed to certain targets. Our customers prefer to buy from green suppliers. We've joined the RE100 club, for example. So that sustainability driver, being able to achieve that without a heavy investment, is a great benefit. Right? I think that the other thing is just to give you a feel and flavor of the different kind of PPA pricing models. Because basically we're selling the electricity, we're not selling the system, right? So how do we price it? And there's different models, and some of them are more appropriate to different markets. So you have the standard discount to tariff model. Basically, the solar PPA tariff is offered at a fixed discount that's pegged to the prevailing utility tariffs. So if the tariff goes up in the market, so does the PPA price. If it goes down, so does the PPA price. But the customer always enjoys a slight discount. Now, these models are evolving into fixed rate models because the price of solar has come down so drastically. We can offer, for example, in Singapore, we're offering 10 Singapore dollar cents fixed for 25 years. That's around 8 US dollar cents or 6.5, 7 euro cents. So at those rates, you want to be able to lock that benefit in as long as possible, right? And then you also have some hybrid models where you can do, say, I fix the price for blocks of 5 years, and then have a fixed escalation every 5 years or 3 years or 10 years. So with these few slides, you're able to show your client what are the benefits of solar, what are they getting into. And the key thing here is, and this is what we found, imagine if I'm walking into your business and asking you to sign a 25-year contract with me, you're going to think I'm insane, right? But how I describe it to people is, look, solar leasing or solar PPA is like putting on a hat. You put on a hat, you start saving money, you go green, everything's good. But if you can never take that hat off to scratch your head or change the cap, you're not going to wear it for 25 years. So I need to create a level of flexibility that's balanced with bankability, right? So as an example, if you have a site sale or transfer, the contract can be transferred to the new owner, so you don't block the ability of the person to change his business. If the site relocates, well, solar is modular. As you could see in those earlier slides, I can clamp onto your roof. So if you move your site, I can relocate the system. Of course, there's going to be labor charges and downtime charges, but with a degree of planning, it's possible. Same thing with renovation. And finally, early termination. The client can always buy out the system at any point in the contract at a pre-negotiated price. Right? So when you highlight the long-term flexibility, that usually gives clients a lot of comfort. You then look at the lease completion, right? What happens after, right? So you outline to the client, hey, you can take over the system, enjoy the ownership and free power for 5, 7, 10 years. You can renew it. We can repower the site with the latest panels and technology of the day. Or finally, you can remove it, and that should be modeled as part of the system cost upfront, right? So I think the idea here was to give you guys, honestly, a bit of our secret sauce is why we're pretty good at helping clients understand and adopt solar. So we spend a lot of time to help them get comfortable, to emphasize our key messages, and get it to a stage where the client says, right, I'm ready to go. What next? So then begins the development. And this is a very meaty chunk, right? I would say this is my appetizer now. I mean, this is my main course now.
Before we go into the appetizer, I want to remind the audience to send in their questions during the presentation already. So Sam will answer them after the presentation. Sorry to interrupt, Sam.
Perfect reminder, actually. That's exactly it, guys. Please feel free to send your questions in, and the Solarplaza team will curate them, and we'll have a nice little Q&A at the end. Okay, so development. Your client said, all right, guys, I'm interested. I'm keen. What next? Well, look, you got to start with the site, right? It's where you're hosting your system. So what are the things you need to think about? The type of roof, because that's going to impact your mounting. The site lease tenor, right? If I'm offering a 15, 20, 25-year PPA, I got to make sure that the site lease is around for that long, or the site is owned by the client. We then look at rooftop access, right? How do we get up to the roof? Are there existing staircases? Do I need to build a cat ladder? And I'll show you an example shortly. Array spacing, for example, you need to know your local regulations and building code. In Singapore, as an example, you have certain restrictions on your array lengths by the fire safety department. So these are the things as part of your homework and localization. You need to know, what are your local permitting like? Finally, the weight load. The good thing is any roof that a human being can stand on, well, a human being is already 4 times the weight of a solar system. The solar system has a weight load of less than 15 kilograms per meter squared. Right? But again, you need to make sure that the roof doesn't require additional strengthening and that it's a good solid roof. So as an example with access, okay, if you remember that the oil rig project I showed you, right, this is the one. It was about 12 or 15 meters high and there was no access. So we had to build this new ladders. We had to build the cat ladder and the bracing. And of course, that was quite expensive. So obviously you have to factor these things into your project cost, right? Okay, now I'm going to get a little technical. The idea is to just give you a feel and flavor of the kind of things you need to look at on the technical side. Remember, we talked about the grid feedback, right? Well, the way to determine how much your client is going to consume is by doing a load study. So the red is his load. So basically, we got a half-hourly dump of all his load readings. And then the blue is his load. And the red is my PV, right? You see every day the PV peaks. Now, the delta between these two is how much I'm going to feed back. So it's really important you do a load study, either through available load data or you put a data logger in there to know exactly what your client's going to consume versus what you're going to feed into the grid. The next one is the module or solar panel layout, right? So in this case, this is slightly older panel layout, but this is where your EPC will be supporting you in all these various technical pre-dev support. Right? So in this case, we have 2,300 panels. It's about a 6,000 square meter rooftop area. I've left the room for maintenance runways. So when I do the layout based on receiving the roof plans, that's when I'll know how much capacity that I have with which to make my model. Simulating the yield is critical. There is an industry standard software called PVSYST. This is one of the investment grade software. It's quite complex. It does require technical training to use, but it basically will show you how much energy you produce every month, how much is your specific yield, how much megawatt hour, your performance ratio. Basically, all of these things will help you when you do your financial modeling. I'm not going to spend too much time here because I'm aware of the clock. Let's just move on this part. I want to talk about the financial side, without going into very heavy, kind of clunky financial modeling stuff. I want to talk to you about IRR, right? So the IRR is the internal rate of return. Basically, it's the percentage return that the investors are looking at, right? And this number can vary across different geographies according to country risk, off-taker risk, FX risk, right? So as an example, the solar IRR is considered over the entire life cycle of the solar system. So it's a long-term consideration, right? And with the right customer targeting, you can achieve a pretty attractive pre-tax IRR. I'm not going to provide numbers here, but that's a question that can be asked later, simply because, as an example, in Indonesia, you're looking at 11 to 12%. In Singapore, you're looking at 7 to 8% because of the very different risk profiles of the country. And then, of course, if you get leverage or gearing, basically debt financing from the banks, that can also help lift up your equity IRR. And finally, there's some upside in the future by monetizing carbon credits or renewable energy certificates. But these are just some of the considerations when you look at the IRR. Right? How we always show investors, look, compared to the bond, an IRR is a solar project basically produces long-term, stable, predictable revenue, right? Something akin to a bond. So in Indonesia's case, which is the example I used, the bond of the country over 25 years provides 7% return. So through solar, if I can provide you 11 or 12% return, you're basically taking a similar country risk, but enjoying a much better return over time, right? It's a good way to help investors understand that. Okay, I want to spend at least a minute on this slide. Again, it's so important to understand the different levers. What impacts the returns? And I've ordered these points in the level of impact. So the number one impact on project returns in CNI is the CapEx, the total cost of installation plus development cost. It is number one. Closely followed by that is the PPA tariff, right? How much revenue are you going to make? Then any escalation within the tariff, right? In some cases, there's a fixed rate or a fixed escalator or a utility-based escalator. That also plays a big impact on the return. Next is your yield. How much energy are you going to generate? And if you remember that map from earlier, of course, the higher the irradiation, the higher your yield, and therefore the higher your return. Right? Then we move into the OPEX, which is the operation and maintenance, the monitoring, the system insurance, replacing your inverter. The good thing in solar is that the OPEX is generally quite low. It's 1 to 2 percentage points of CapEx per year should cover everything, particularly for larger scale projects. There's also an escalation in OPEX because there's rising labor costs and rising inflation. So we map and model all of that in upfront. Then, of course, the PPA tenor. Look, the solar system has a life cycle of 25 years. The panels are warranted to perform for that long. But in some cases, the client's willing to pay a slightly higher tariff, to enjoy a faster handover. So, for example, a 15-year PPA would have a higher tariff, but then the client would enjoy 10 years on the back end of free power. For panel degradation, that's another important one. Panels are made of silicon. Silicon degrades. The better the panels that you use, the less your degradation is going to be, and therefore the higher your return. And finally, gearing, leverage, as I mentioned. So are you able to get financing from the banks? Probably not at your first few megawatts, but eventually the banks would come in when there's a sizable portfolio. The higher the tenor, the lower the interest rate, and the higher the leverage amount, the better your equity return would be. Right? So I think that's an important slide for those who are interested in the financing side. A little bit about solar contract structure. You'll notice here we've called it solar rental. In some places it's called solar leasing. In some places it's called solar PPA. The reason is there's different regulations in different countries, right? So the good thing with a PPA is that it is an operating lease where the system does not reflect on the client's balance sheet. This is quite important because that can cause quite an issue to certain accounting regulations or the client's tax obligations. And it's traditionally what's known as a build, own, operate, transfer structure, right? The pricing is pretty straightforward. You're basically getting monthly payments for clean energy that you generate and the client consumes from the system at an agreed rate over the contract duration, right? So that's the revenue model or the pricing model. And finally, at the end of your lease, you can either hand it over to your client, or you can renew it, or you can dismantle it. Now, again, important slide. So the ones where I don't have pictures are the ones that are really important, because that's really neat, all right? So several areas to consider. When you have a 20-year contract with somebody else's equipment on somebody else's rooftop, developed by yet another party and maintained by another one, i.e. the ecosystem, there's a lot of things to think about and consider, right? So I'm not going to talk about, negotiating PPAs, because there's a lot of content out there. Solarplaza has published the handbook that you guys can look at. I'm just going to talk about overall, what are the things to think about? So we talked about the relocation and renovation, system insurance, right? It's so critical to have your system insured against damage, theft, third party, force majeure, and also the property owner needs to make sure they have insurance in place. That's something you need to demand from them, or request rather. Access to sunlight, right? Sunlight is my raw material, that's my fuel. So the client needs to contractually commit to prevent blocking my sunlight. Now, what happens if a neighbor nearby building, a big tall tower comes up? I mean, that's a real risk, and your client can't control that. You can't control that. It's an unforeseen risk, right? Therefore, please be very discerning at the site survey. Look at master plans or zoning plans that have been released in your neighborhoods or your areas. Use your common sense and look around to see if there's a big development coming up. Most likely there's going to be a large tower, right? And finally, maintain the option to relocate the system to another client site or a third-party site in the event of sunlight blockage from a nearby tower, right? In the event in 7-10 years it comes up. Okay, non-payment. This is huge, right? In certain countries, let's call them emerging markets in quotes. In certain countries, contract enforcement is tough. For example, in India, Indonesia, it's not easy. The courts take 8-10 years to resolve these things. So how do you mitigate this? Extensive upfront due diligence. Look at your client's balance sheets. Look at his debt ratio. Talk to some of his vendors or customers. Look at how big his employees are, how long they've been in business, right? It's this KYC, your client. In some cases, you can ask your client to put down a bank guarantee to cover, say, 6 months of payments. In other cases, when it's a AAA rated MNC, I don't think that's a major issue, right? Contract enforcement. So I always say to my clients, to my investors, the purpose of a PPA is to do everything possible to avoid early termination. So we always believe in relationship-based approach. Look, I'm supplying you power from your rooftop that's at a cheaper rate. So obviously there's a benefit. Now, if you don't want to pay me, what's wrong? Is it that my rate is much higher than the grid? Is it that I'm not generating what I said I would? It cannot be that a client who's in business would suddenly decide to switch off his electricity to avoid paying a cheaper rate for power. So that's why we feel that in these PPAs, instead of bringing my lawyer to the table, we use our relationship. We try to understand what's wrong. We try to figure it out, because the inherent fundamental nature is this is a win-win-win for everybody, right? Monitoring, billing, critical. So please only use digital power meters with the best availability functions, with online meter reading, super critical. Also to validate the performance ratio. So if I'm giving an energy guarantee, I need to be able to validate that. So in all our systems, we always say to put a weather station that can measure the sunlight, and there's a very simple calculation with which you can work out your PR, or performance ratio. Without a measurement or weather station on site, it's kind of impossible to do it. Okay, we have about 10 to 15 minutes left before we open up the Q&A. So it's actually good timing, because now I'm very proud of this. This is actually one of our larger systems for one of the biggest government-linked clients in Singapore. This is a live case study. I was just on site last weekend, about 7 days ago, a week before my birthday. So a really nice birthday present. This is how a solar system comes to life. And this is a big one, okay? This is a 10,000 square meter rooftop, so 100,000 square foot. So basically, we won the project and we signed it in October. The conditions precedent was completed in November. Construction started shortly after in December. And within 4 months, we're going to commission this bad boy. So it's actually quite exciting. Solar projects can come to life very fast on the rooftops. We don't have environmental clearances, permits, and all that. So look, this is what a big average rooftop looks like. This is a trapezoid rooftop. I have the vertical seams that I can clamp onto. I have all these various protrusions that I've accounted for in my designs. I have the existing parapet walls in place, so I know where to hook up my safety lines, right? And we talked about access, right? So where you don't have access to the topmost part, for example, in Singapore, the Civil Defense Force is the fire safety regulator. So it's very clear. If you don't have access to the topmost part of your roof, the first thing you do is build those ladders to make sure that we have access. Second is safety, right? In solar, like any business, we hold safety to the utmost regard. We don't want people dying on our watch. Business is not worth anything like that. So for us, we'll always follow global work health and safety standards. There's various safety inductions, risk assessments, method statements. Your EPC contractor should be handling that. The safety lines, right, are all installed before any construction can start. Then you have hoisting and loading, right? We have 4,000, 5,000 2x1 meter panels that need to be loaded onto this rooftop. So we have these large cranes. You generally need a traffic controller. You got to work through access schedules with your client. You got to make sure your workers are constantly harnessed, right? These are work at heights regulations. And you're hoisting these panels in pallets as they arrive onto the roof. So the first thing that gets installed are the mounting rails. Just look at the size of this guy. Apologies for the blurry photo. That's a human being. We can just get a sense of how big this rooftop is, right? So we install all of the rails, which is the first part. And then to avoid clogging our client's site with container loads of panels, we've come up with this innovation. We basically secure with lashing and cabling sets of panels onto the mounting rails. So this way, I can actually spread my load across the roof, store my panels on site as I install them, and avoid plugging up my client site, right? This is the inverters, right? The inverters, I'm assuming people on this webinar are at least basically familiar with solar, but the inverters are what convert the DC energy to AC energy. Usually in hot tropical countries, we will build a shed to protect from rain and heat. This is the Building Construction Authority in Singapore. That's why we need approvals. And we have a ballast-based solution, right? So the inverter shed is, we have about 50 of these inverters, all housed in these 2 or 3 sheds. This was as of, just about a week ago. Happy to say that this week, this number has got up to 80%. Solar is like Lego once you get it up there. So it's nice feeling to see it come to life. Okay, the DC cables. So what you will see is we are running the conduits alongside the entire array. The reason is each solar panel is connected to each other, and then each string is connected to a particular inverter. So these DC cable conduits make sure that, or allow for, our cabling not to be tied up, not to be left untidy, not to be getting losses and damage. So cable conduits and good quality conduits are key. Right? You then have the AC cabling. So you remember the inverter sheds? Well, my DC cables go to the inverters, and then the power is pulled out of those inverters and fed right into the client's distribution board. This is what's called behind the meter, right? So unlike the utility game where I'm pumping it into a substation, over here, it's being consumed as it's used, directly into a client's distribution board. It's called the interconnection, basically. Energy monitoring is key. We're selling a product that we can't touch or hold. So to be able to visualize it, to show our clients how much they're saving, how much power, you can look at it on your phones, on your tablets. And we always love to throw in a kind of free HD TV that we mount up in our client's reception, of course, with our logos on the side, but to show and display in real time. And clients love that. So that's a little trick. Throw in a freebie. It's a $700 TV on a $1.7 million system, and clients love that. Okay, this is just a very quick glimpse of what the construction schedules look like, or rather the weekly progress reports. So you got to make sure that your EPC is sending you these reports. You can send it to your investors, to your clients. They really should be using state-of-the-art software and properly managing the project. You can see where things are delayed, where things are on time, what are things that need to be addressed. So proper project management is critical. Okay. Okay, this one I'm very happy to show you. It's a bit laggy, but this is basically a panorama video of our site, our newest and biggest baby. Um, it's pretty large. It's quite a nice feeling to see such a large project come to life. It's the equivalent of powering 450 three-bedroom flats. Okay, that's quite a lot of power. Okay, and now I'm quite happy I've stuck on time. The last kind of 2 to 3 minutes before we open up the Q&A is what do we do after the project is commissioned, right? So let's work through that. There's 2 or 3 key functionalities. One is the monthly billing. So as a responsible developer, you want to be able to have a good monitoring dashboard. This is basically an API that's connected directly to my revenue grade meter. So I can see on a daily basis, monthly basis, weekly basis, how much am I generating? And using this, I can create my monthly invoice, right? So having that access and a bit of familiarity with the dashboard is super important. Then every month or every quarter, we prepare a generation report. We show how much has been cumulatively generated, how much was used, how much was exported to the grid. All of this will help with the invoicing to the client and the performance tracking by the investor. So creating these generation reports in meaningful visual ways is a very nice way to support the management. And finally, the operation and maintenance scope, right? This is basically a screenshot from an O&M contract. So the things that your O&M contractor, who is quite often your EPC contractor, need to do will be a visual inspection of modules, cleaning when necessary, checking all the cables, the radiation sensors, the mounting system. The key is to check all the electrical cabling, make sure there's no loose connections, because that's where there's always a source of possible issues. Generally, it's with the cables, connectors, and the workmanship, right? Because the panel is fixed, the inverter is standalone. You also need to make sure you clean the dust and ensure there's ventilation, submitting the monthly generation reports. Every year, we do a thermographic scan with a drone, right? So if you fly your drone over a field of solar panels or a rooftop, you can see which ones are not generating or not producing any heat. Then you can kind of test for broken panels. And finally, ad hoc. The monitoring system will tell you if something's off. If something's off, you call your contractors to come down to site. And what's interesting on the frequency is that, guys, in Singapore, we're in the tropics. So the Almighty takes care of a lot of our cleaning. He makes it rain quite a lot, and our panels are at a slight inclination. In the desert, for example, in the Middle East and Dubai, one of my developer friends out there, he needs to do a weekly cleaning, right? So can you imagine the difference in cost or OPEX where you are in a tropical country with lots of rain versus a desert with a lot of dust? So these are all the things you need to kind of factor in, right? And yeah, this kind of brings me to my last slide, which is basically, just sharing a few of my personal insights. Look, I'm just going to use 1 or 2 minutes to talk about my story briefly. The reason, I decided to start this company and have 2 or 3 of my closest friends join me was that because we believe in solar energy. I've always believed in it, especially in the urban setting. I'm sure you guys have come across these statistics where, oh, 1 day of sunlight can power the whole world and all that jazz. Look, the truth is there. The amount of kilojoules entering our everyday life by the sun is insane, right? But what really attracts me to it is, number one, sunshine belongs to everybody. No country can say, this is my oil reserve, these are my borders. What sun falls on you, it falls on me too. It is a democratized source of energy. And secondly, it is infinite. The day the sun stops shining is the day we all die, right? So in my mind, because I'm a firm believer of a free and fair world and a peaceful world, call me naive, but I believe that if we're able to finally harness our God-given resource, and thankfully to technological advancements, to financing innovations, through just entrepreneurs coming together and putting this stuff together, putting these models together, I think we have a real shot of solving our energy crisis, right? And if you look at our history, how many wars have been started over oil, right? The stuff that is just killing our earth anyway. So, I feel that solar energy is the way forward. I think that the real revolution will happen on the rooftops. I think the future is now. And, I'm just really glad that we were able to hang on. We've been through our fair share of problems. We got swallowed up by the big boys. We went through failed acquisitions. We hung on through pure grit and resiliency because we believe. And lo and behold, today, I no longer have to run around to find funding. I have 4 or 5 different investors vying for our projects. I no longer have to sit and spend 6 months convincing a client on the benefits of solar leasing. I no longer have to pay exorbitant prices to EPC contractors who were far and few between because so many more are springing up. And for those who are looking at the CNI business as a developer, as an adopter, as an EPC, all I can say is, as an entrepreneur and true believer, the time is now. And I want to really thank all of you for making the time today to listen to me and giving your time and your energy. I want to thank Solarplaza team who've been, we've been working together for a while, and this is my first webinar. I've never done something like this before at such a global stage. I hope it was engaging. I hope it was interesting. I am definitely around. You can reach me via email or LinkedIn. And I think with that, I'd like to conclude from my side and open up the Q&A for the last kind of 10, 15 minutes.
First of all, thanks a lot for super interesting presentation, Sam. And you already said you hope that it was engaging. Well, given the amount of questions coming in, it was definitely engaging. And
I'm glad already, to hear
that. We're not going to manage to answer all of them in 10 minutes. Now on the screen, your email address. And as we already discussed before the webinar, please, if we don't come to answer all the questions, feel free to send Sam an email about any questions regarding the presentation. Please feel free to send me an email, any questions regarding the webinar or the conference, of course. Then so maybe we just go ahead to the first questions. A quite open question, a quite wide question, I think. What is the biggest challenge you face throughout your business model?
Great question, yeah. Big question. I will zero in on, let's say, 3 of the key challenges, okay? Number 1, finding the money. It was so hard for us to raise our first 200,000, and it's so much easier to raise the next 2 million. It's weird. And there's a whole another webinar one day about where do you find these funds. Very briefly, private investors, industry players, existing IPPs, there's a whole batch of areas. But yes, finding the funds for the first few small projects was really, really tough. Okay. The second one, cost control on CapEx. For the longest time, we depended on an EPC and he just named his price and we just ran with it because we didn't know better. And over the years, after we've understood the game and understood the different BOQ or line items, bill of quantities, understood where the market pricing is, we're able to drive a much better deal. And as you remember, CapEx was one of the biggest drivers of returns. So the first one was funding. Second one was CapEx and cost control. And the third one, honestly, as entrepreneurs, was the development cycle. It's extremely volatile and it's not for everybody. One day you're on a high, the other day you're on a low. One day the investor signed a term sheet, the next day he's reneged. One day a client said yes. Wow, you're like Titanic riding the wave. The other day the competitor comes and undercuts you and you're gone. So developing the resilience and the anti-fragility, being able to thrive in the volatile and risky environment took us a long time. So yes, to answer, number 1, funding, number 2, CapEx and cost control, and number 3, the entrepreneurial grit and resiliency to survive the volatile development cycle.
All right, thanks a lot, Sam, for this, I think, very clear answer. Maybe another question, a bit more practical. What is your best practice yard, say, in terms of CAPEX hardware and OPEX software related to plant performance, monitoring and optimization compared to the cost directly related to the solar plant? How does this change comparing rather small CNI projects about 100 kilowatt towards increasingly bigger 600, 700 kilowatt plants?
Look, good question. Look, let's start with, remember we talked about the weather station earlier, right? So generally a nice Kippens-on pyrometer is going to cost you about $3,000 US, right? Now when it's a 100 kilowatt system, most developers just skimp on it because it's percentage points of your CapEx. But what we've learned the hard way, particularly when we had to on-sell some of the older operating assets, that you need to have a weather station on each of your system, regardless of size. right? Because without that, you simply cannot validate the performance ratio of your plant. Okay, so that's one example. Another example is, previously there were separate monitoring systems required. In some cases, there would be $30,000 for a fancy monitoring system, which is important because as investors with distributed assets, you clearly need to know what your system is generating in real time. Thankfully, these days, some of the inverter manufacturers, such as Huawei, right, kudos to the Chinese, they've innovated where they've built in very strong and granular monitoring and visualizing capability within the inverter. So now my SCADA system, which is basically the internet to internet protocol system, can connect to the same point and get the same high level of monitoring, which previously used to cost me $30,000 upfront. And then, for example, certain third-party monitoring services, which frankly I think are very good, particularly when you have different type of inverter brands. So if you have 10 different projects with 10 different components, my God, trying to have 10 different dashboards and portals is a pain. So that's when you can consider to invest in a kind of consolidated third-party monitoring that can overlay on top of all the various different components and create a unified dashboard. So we were quite lucky. Our EPC managed to do that in-house. So it's basically an IT solution. So that's something we would recommend, that once you start getting a number of different projects, to consider having an overlay with a third party. So to summarize, make sure to have the weather station so that you can validate your PR, budget for it even in smaller projects. Consider using inverters that have a high level of monitoring and visualization built in to reduce your cost. And then finally, consider investing into third-party monitoring service that can consolidate into singular dashboard across different projects and components.
All right, thanks a lot, Sam. Again, a clear answer, I think. Maybe a super practical short question regarding the actual production of existing assets. Do you see that it is in line with the forecast made in PVsyst?
Great question. Whoever asked that, please send me an email. I'd like to treat you to an e-beer. The simple, straight answer is no. No. And here's why. The PVsyst is based on data over the last 50 years, climate data. I believe all of us on this webinar can agree climate is changing. So what we see, when we see a PVsyst output, we will always use what's called a P95 value, basically 5% less than what it shows. So when you assume something like that, then over time you will see your forecast is pretty much, your actual yield is pretty much in line. So we'll always advise our EPC partners and investors, guys, please don't just read the PVsyst and tell me that's the yield you're going to get. Okay. In addition, we're pretty fortunate to have been around for so long and working with good quality EPC contractors who have a lot of operating data. Right. So I'll give you an example. Out of our first pilot portfolio of 4 or 5 small projects, some of them outperformed what I thought I would get. Some of them grossly underperformed. And then what we did a diagnosis, right? So, and I'll be honest, for the first few projects of 100, 200 kilowatts, we didn't even do PVsyst. This was 7 years ago. We didn't have money for PVsyst, right? But what we found is that there are a number of reasons. Number one, it's workmanship. Number two, it's crappy components. Number three, it's just unlucky that, for example, my shipyard site, I had 2 exhausts spitting out paint dust, right? If anybody's ever parked in a shipyard, you see what happens to your car frame or car window after an hour. So to come back to the PVsyst part, I will say, no, it is not the same as PVsyst. Please use a P95 value. And if you're conservative with your estimates, you will find that the solar system will match those estimates, in many cases outperform. In the cases that it underperforms, please do diagnostics to see why, and you'll find a host of reasons, such as what I've mentioned earlier.
All right. I think that's a very insightful answer and also a very honest answer, but that's only useful, I think. Sam, there's a bunch of questions with different angles, but quite some about battery storage. Could you just use a couple of minutes to share your thoughts on when it comes into play, when it's useful, and maybe even a timeline, maybe if it would change over time?
Look, I hear you. Again, just in full transparency, we have yet to do a PPA with solar batteries, solar plus storage. We have done one in the Maldives, a small one, with solar plus storage plus diesel. Okay. Now, there's 2 reasons to this. Number one, technical. Sizing a battery bank to cover the entire load is ginormous and very expensive. And number two, the cost was very prohibitive. Okay. Now, even when we're competing against diesel, because obviously diesel generation cost for electricity is very high, even then we found the storage was too expensive. Having said all that, I myself have been keeping a very keen eye on the storage, and here's what I see. Here's the times to use it, in my humble opinion. Number one, if there's an instance where you are feeding back to the grid and you have zero net metering policy, for example, Indonesia, well, in that case, because the battery costs have come down a lot, you could still put a small element of storage so that at least you get something for that weekend load. Right? The second situation is geographies where you have a high power price. So for example, Australia, for example, the UK, right? Now, what I'm seeing over there, grid level storage is coming into play. And at that kind of scale, when you have megawatt hour batteries, you can achieve pretty competitive solar tariffs with storage. However, with CNI, if I'm being honest, I don't see it come into play, at least in my region in Southeast Asia, where power prices are pretty cheap, at least for the next 2 to 3 years. Having said that, on the industrial side, particularly for remote applications, some of our very friendly companies, some of the companies that are friendly to us, solar companies, have launched solutions for the mining industry, where they send a container, there's a bunch of panels, there's a battery, there's some hybrid component, and then they offer it at a unified tariff. So while, I'm sorry this one's not as clear-cut an answer, because frankly, it's a pretty tough question. But to summarize, we haven't done it before due to kind of technical and cost considerations. We do see a potential for it to be integrated into areas where you have a very high power price or where you're not getting anything for your feedback energy. And we do see that over the next, in my view, probably 3 to 4 years, as battery costs follow the same trajectory of solar costs or solar panel costs, that there might be a business case. Right? That would be my inputs.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and I think it's completely logical that you cannot give a super clear-cut answer, and there's whole conferences even about just storage. So, but it was just nice to hear your views on it as an experienced player in this market. And then maybe a completely different question. What is the most effective client origination strategy in your experience? Is that direct emailing, web-based SEO, or what is it? And how much would you reserve for that? Is the second part of that question.
Excellent. I was waiting for somebody to ask this question. How do you find the damn clients? They don't grow on trees, right? Well, so first of all, we have never done paid advertising, nor paid speaking, nor paid promotion. I don't believe in it. Okay, and here's why. First and foremost, the beauty of the CNI solar adopter is, like I said earlier, any business that is operating any kind of business whatsoever that has a facility, has an asset, has an office, has a factory, that has a rooftop is a potential client. Obviously, you have to apply your filters that we talked about, but what I found is the first place to start is your private and professional network. We all know people. We all know people who work in different places. As an example, I knew one guy who worked at Microsoft. I asked him, hey, I've just looked at Google. You have a nice site. Can you connect me to your facility manager? Or, my cousin worked in a bank. So I asked him, hey, can you connect me to the guy in charge of all the bank branches? So the personal and professional network to ask anybody for a referral to their company's facilities manager or facilities team is an easy way. It's a good way. The second thing I found were events. Now, I'm not, no disrespect, Solarplaza, but I'm not talking solar specific events, which are more for industry players. I'm talking about, hotel conferences, right? I used to, in my younger days, just to go show up. I couldn't afford a ticket to these conferences, but I would go show up, stand around, wait for the networking, wait for people to come out, just go talk to people, start getting contacts, right? So go to these industry events with a view to connect with those, like the marine industry is a perfect one, right? I would go to the shipping events, boring as hell, but you know what? You meet shipyard owners, you meet, I mean, no disrespect to the shipping industry, just my own bias, but the point is going to industry events where are very specific for those industries are a great way. You just go pick up 100 cards, You got to have a very nice, short, sharp key message. That was the other thing. My key messaging was very strong. You know, our company profile was very nice. So once we got those leads, oh, and finally, and this is where today I use to practice my origination, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a very strong way to reach the corporate world. We tried Facebook. In those days, there wasn't any Instagram. Facebook is fine. You know, you get some likes and you feel good about yourself, but it's not really a way to reach out to people. Through LinkedIn, and you know, I'd love for you, any of you guys want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please go ahead. I have a lot of different contacts and you can leverage those. Please take a look at my LinkedIn profile. If you put in the time and effort to have an all-star clearly conveys what you're about, then when you reach out to people, I reach out to facility managers of semiconductor industries. Now look, maybe half of them don't bother responding to me, okay? Maybe half of them don't even accept my invite. But I can tell you, I have got into some of the biggest clients through reaching out to their management or their relevant departments through LinkedIn. And I make an effort to follow the kind of companies and see their content. So when I reach out to them, I'm not just coming in as a sales guy, but I'm saying, hey, I saw your article in XYZ, or B, I saw this initiative that you were in. Wouldn't we love to help you, you know, further your sustainability goals? So to summarize, you know, this whole thing about paid advertisement, you put a TV ad and showcase your CEO. I mean, that's so 1980s, guys. We live in the 2020s, right? So use your personal network, friends and family, ask for introduction to the relevant teams, go to events that are specific to certain industries, you know, just you know, be there, show up, go to a lot of these different events where you meet different people, get their cards, send them your mailers or your short and sharp, succinct outreach, and finally leverage the power of LinkedIn, which I think is a very good way to reach specific people in specific companies.
All right, that's interesting, and also not the answer I expected, to be honest. So an eye opener. Sam, I think given the amount of questions still open, you're gonna receive a lot of emails after this webinar. I'm afraid we're already over time, so we have to round off.
Let's do one last one, Thomas. One last one. So many people do it. One last one.
All right,
one last
then let me open all the questions again, because well, Marcus next to me, he just closed it off. Before we go into the last question, let me mention that on the right side in the software, people see they can already download your slides and they will receive the recordings tomorrow, and that email will also include the slides. Let me see, what do we grab? Let's go to the highest rated question. Let me see. Yeah, so you're a vertically integrated company. How do you see that as a benefit, and what are the downsides? And maybe also tapping in on some other questions. Do you see that change over time as the industry changes? So, for example, as it matures, do you think people will have more specialized companies?
So somebody clearly wasn't listening who asked that question, because the thing I specified in slide 2 was that we are not a vertically integrated company. We are an independent developer, right? We are an ecosystem player, right? So all of those things mean that we do not do all of the different functions under the same platform. The reason is very simple. One, coming down to our company values. I talked about this, how we all like to do things together and create an ecosystem and an industry, right? To enable different kind of players to play together and not get swallowed up by the 3 big corporates with ginormous cash who come in and then do the EPC, development, origination, funding, management all in-house, because then they become very clunky, right? So we are not vertically integrated, and we're very proud of it. In fact, we're the last standing independent developer in Singapore. And now our time has come, because this market is dominated by the 3 big guys. But now a lot of other big guys with a lot of big money want to come into our market. And lo and behold, we're one of the few places to come into to get projects, to work on different deals together. The other reason is specialization. The DNA of an investor versus the entrepreneurial DNA of a developer versus the technical DNA of an EPC contractor are completely different. And when I see, you know, with EPC contractors, you know, seeing them trying to talk sophisticated financing language to an investor while having a very kind of sales, education, sales-based approach to the client, there's always a big gap. And similarly for us to try to, you know, negotiate with suppliers and consultants and authorities approvals, we don't have that DNA. So actually, for us, and I'm not saying this is the right strategy for everybody, but up until a certain point in scale, and also as a founder, you have to take a call. Look, I am proud to say that I'm a free bird. There are no strings on me. That also means at certain times when the big waves come, unless we're very nimble and can weather those storms, we could also crash. So there's trade-offs, right? On the other side, if I look at some of my competition in Singapore, one of them is a big government company, right? I mean, these guys are having nice, cushy salaries every month. Whether they deliver or not, it doesn't matter. Whether they actually make a decent return doesn't matter because it's kind of, absorbed into a multi-bazillion-dollar balance sheet. For them, they have their advantages, right? They can say no to certain deals. They can, let's say, squeeze every last penny out of the value chain and leave every supplier at EPC almost bleeding, but they'll still get the job done at a better price. So, to come back to that question and now to answer it specifically, number one, we are not vertically integrated. We prefer to have an ecosystem of specialists, each who are very good at what they do. And our role in value add is to create more value than sum of parts. Number three, as the market matures, look, after going through my failed acquisition, I don't think I'll ever entertain, having a shareholder pumping in millions of dollars in my company and then trying to do every single thing under the sun. Rather, I would look to double or triple down on what we do really well, create multiple ecosystems to create and share the pie with more people. But as the industry matures, you will definitely see more consolidation, right? There will be shakeouts, there will be M&As. But for Solar Horizon, for what it's worth, we are proud of our independent status. We may be the little guys, but it gives us flexibility, gives us agility. People like working with us. We're really good at what we do. And the biggest lesson I learned was knowing my strengths, but also knowing my weaknesses. So where we know we are not that strong, we work with good partners whom we trust, who are much better at doing their piece of the thing than we are. And together, we form these ecosystems that I think are the absolute fundamental backbone of the CNI business.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sam. I think it's still very interesting answer to not a right question. Yeah, now we really have to end the webinar, I'm afraid. We're already 10 minutes over time. I still see a lot of people online though. Thing is, I have to run to my next meeting. So thanks a lot, Sam. I think a super interesting presentation. Both me and Marco were very impressed, and also given the amount of questions and interaction we saw, a lot of people thought it was really interesting. Please send your questions to Sam's email address that's now not on the screen anymore. Now it's back. And Sam, thanks a lot. One last referral to Making Solar Bankable, happening 6th and 7th February in Amsterdam. Please check out the website. We have a super interesting lineup, and I think that will be 2 interesting days. So thanks again. Thanks to the audience as well for joining us today.
And Thomas, I'd like to just give a last closing statement. First of all, to echo your thanks to everybody for joining. Secondly, look, guys, we're all about creating partnerships and doing business and sharing the knowledge. And for those who might have any interest in Southeast Asia, who might have any interest in learning more and more specific kind of programs, look, please reach out. Don't just send me a list of 100 questions, but reach out, set up a call, get in touch with LinkedIn, tell me about yourselves. What are your interests? I'd love to connect. I'm a people person, and I would love to see out of this session whether some nice opportunities can arise for us, for me, and to collaborate with the audience members and Solarplaza team. I'll be looking forward to the next event in Singapore. USC Asia should be exciting this year. I wish you all the best at making solar bankable. Next year, please call me to speak. I think I can share quite a lot at that event. And I think this year is going to be awesome, and I'll be closely following it. But then thanks again to everybody. It's been a fantastic session.
All right. Thanks, Sam. Next time we'll call you, promise. All right. Thanks.
All right.